what we do and what we value is just very different in our justice system. And it's not universally admired and it's not shared. Time and again, I was reminded that the way we think about justice in the United States is not necessarily, it's not just that it's not the only way to think about it, it's that it's maybe not a healthy way to think about it.
Hi everyone, welcome to the Vandal Theory, a podcast about science and research at University of Idaho. I am your host for the day. My name is Danae Lenz, and I am the External Communications Coordinator for U of I. And I am joined by Lee. Hi Lee.
Hi Danae. My name's Lee Cooper, and I am the science writer and editor here at University of Idaho.
So today we're going to talk about the intersection of culture and law. So I have a question. When you were growing up, did your parents ever let you do anything without their supervision that many parents today might be sort of alarmed by?
Oh, I'm sure. I'm right on the edge of, I'm an old millennial. I know there's kind of the trope of, 80s kids were feral, left outside and told not to come back till dinner. That spilled over a little bit. Like, I definitely biked around with my friends all over town. Our parents generally knew where we were. It wasn't like a complete mystery or anything, but stuff like that. And then, maybe one of the other ones that I would think of is sleepovers. I know sleepovers there's a lot more kind of anxiety around them at this point. And we slept over at each other's houses all the time.
I also grew up sleeping over at people's houses, and I was born in the 90s, so solidly a millennial, but I sort of fit that feral child stereotype because my mom, who was never super far away, if something happened, she would have been there. But she was definitely the type that shooed me out the door and said, "Don't come back till dinner." So our interviewee today is David Pimentel. He's a professor in University of Idaho's College of Law. His work explores the intersections of law, history, and culture. Today he's discussing lessons from his work in international justice reform, the balance between risk and autonomy in parenting, and the power of music to potentially change the world. You ready to get into it?
This is such a weird intersection. I'm ready to go.
Hi, David. Welcome to the podcast.
Thanks. It's a privilege to be here.
Can you go ahead and introduce yourself? Just give us a brief overview of who you are and what you do.
I'm a professor of law at the University of Idaho, and I've been here about 10 years, but I had followed kind of a long and tortured path to find my way to University of Idaho and even to find my way to academia. I grew up in the San Francisco area, and I went to law school at Berkeley and Harvard, and then practiced law for a couple of years in Seattle. And then I went to work for the federal courts for 10 years, doing various types of court administration. Then in 2002, went abroad to do consulting on court reform in post-conflict countries, starting with Bosnia. So I can tell you more about that. I do research, obviously, in areas of court reform and rule of law reform and post-conflict justice. But I've also become very interested in some marginally related topics that have captured my fascination.
So, yes, I first want to ask you exactly what you said before about your work in Bosnia. Can you get into that a bit?
I got an opportunity that came kind of out of the blue. I've been working for the federal courts, worked in San Francisco at the Ninth Circuit headquarters, and I've been a Supreme Court fellow in Washington, D.C., and then while I was working at Fifth Circuit headquarters in New Orleans, which has jurisdiction for Texas, Louisiana, and Mississippi, I got this cold call out of the blue asking if I might be willing to go to Bosnia for our 3-month project as a court administration expert. The war had ended in Bosnia just a few years before. A part of the post-conflict peace and reconciliation strategy there was to build a functional justice system so people would take their grievances to court rather than take up arms against each other, which is what had been happening in Bosnia during the conflict. And it was such an exciting opportunity. I quit my job, put the house on the market, and packed up my family, 4 kids, ages ranging 6 to 13, I think. And we moved to Sarajevo, which was a war-torn city at that point. We lived in a place that had bullet holes in the wall, and the kids walked to school past destroyed buildings and things. So it was really quite a compelling experience. And I was a part of a team funded by the Norwegians. I was the only American on the team to help reform a court administration in Bosnia. And it was just a fascinating experience and a very humbling one, because we as Americans are very proud of our justice system. I know a whole lot about how courts should operate. So I'm going to get this system up and running as smoothly as we run in the United States. But before I even entered the building, my host, she was just a brilliant lawyer from New Zealand, warned me. This was January 2002. And she said, as we were entering the building, she said, "Watch out, those steps are slippery." And then she said, "Oh, wait a minute. You're from America. You'd sue because of that, wouldn't you?" And she burst out laughing. And I realized, oh my gosh, the legal system in the United States is maybe the laughingstock of the rest of the world. Yeah, it is true. In the United States, we sue people for icy steps. And that just seemed ridiculous to her and to most of the people I encountered. It wasn't just that. One of the things we were doing to try and make the system more efficient was to help clear the backlog of cases. They had a terrible backlog of criminal cases. They'd been waiting for trial for years. And some of these accused persons had been behind bars for those years, waiting for a trial to decide whether they were in fact guilty or not. And it's like, well, we've got a fundamental justice problem if you've got people behind bars waiting for trial. And the Americans, of course, have the perfect fix for this, and it's called plea bargaining. It's like, oh, you don't have to try them all. Let them plead guilty to lesser offenses, and then you can clear out the cases very quickly. You don't have to impanel juries. You don't have to hold trials. Let them plead to a lesser offense, and we'll resolve it. And it works so great in the United States, after all. We have this great system. And I remember a Bosnian attorney I was meeting with at one point, and he pulled me aside and he said, "You are an American. You must explain this plea bargaining thing to me." And I said, "Okay, well, it's really pretty simple. A prosecutor strikes a deal." And he says, No. I understand what it is. What I don't understand is what it has to do with justice. And I thought, oh, kind of a sucker punch. And I realized that what we do and what we value is just very different in our justice system. And it's not universally admired and it's not shared. Time and again, I was reminded that the way we think about justice in the United States is not necessarily, it's not just that it's not the only way to think about it. It's that it's maybe not a healthy way to think about it. Our criminal justice system is obsessed with punishing bad guys. That's what we call justice. The prosecutor stands on the steps of the courthouse giving a press conference and says, "We want justice for, the victims' families," or whatever. And justice means putting away the bad guys, right? Lock them up. That's justice. As I've worked over the years in a number of different countries and been exposed to a wide range of legal systems and worked side by side when I was with the United Nations with attorneys and judges from all over the world, I realized that justice means something very different in other cultures and societies. And some of them, it's about healing. It's about healing the victim. The victim doesn't even have a role in our criminal justice system, except maybe as a witness. They aren't represented. Nobody's looking out for the victim. It isn't even the victim versus the offender. It's the state versus the offender, right? The victim's kind of on the sidelines. So we don't think about victims that way. There are other places where rather than seeing if we can lock up the bad guys or put them away, they're all about rehabilitating them or about reintegrating the offender into society. Sometimes it's about healing the community. The idea is that somehow we need to find a way for the community to move forward after the horrible thing has happened, this terrible crime has occurred. Sometimes justice is about getting the truth out. What we really need our justice system to do is tell us exactly what happened. And if we know how this happened and how it came about, maybe we can, as a society, can learn something from it. And maybe if the truth is told, then there's a basis or a foundation for reconciliation and forgiveness and things like that are important values in society. But forgiveness and reconciliation are not a part of our system. Our system is not interested in reconciliation and forgiveness. It's far more vindictive than that. And so I teach comparative law at the law school, and we spend a lot of time sort of exploring these other concepts, these other notions of justice. Coming back to Bosnia, they had this terrible problem that cases would go up on appeal, and then they get sent back down, and then they go up on appeal again, and they get sent back down, and it just happened over and over and over, and cases would drag on forever. Our solution is, well, if you discover new evidence after trial, too late. Right? That was on you. You should have brought the evidence at the original trial. And if you didn't bring it then we'll just decide the case without that evidence. And the Bosnians did not understand that. They said, well, our judges have an ethical duty to find the truth. And if we are not convinced, if we as judges are not convinced that we know the full story, if we don't think we have the truth, then we have an obligation to extend the case and order additional investigation until we can actually find the truth. And he says, don't you care about truth? I was like, well, no, truth is not what we're about. We're about doing justice and finding an efficient and practical and reasonable way to get a reasonable approximation of justice. So we're okay. We're okay with somebody pleading guilty to second-degree murder, even though maybe he really committed first-degree murder, because, well, that's close enough. I mean, he gets locked up and saves us a lot of time, and we don't have the uncertainty that, if we insist on trying him for first-degree murder, maybe he'll be acquitted. And that would be worse, that he doesn't get punished at all. And so we're happy to strike these compromises. They say, how can you live with yourself if you're not pursuing truth, if you're not pursuing justice in this way? And I think, okay, well, we can learn a lot from other cultures and from other societies. Our obsession with punishing bad guys gets us pitched in this terrible, ugly, divisive battle in the United States about who are the bad guys. Mm-hmm. Are the bad guys the police? Police brutality? Are the police the bad guys? Defund the police or whatever. Half of America thinks the George Floyds of the world are the real bad guys, and we should have the police's back. And because all we care about is punishing bad guys, we get in this pitched and ugly and divisive battle over who are the bad guys instead of talking about things like truth and reconciliation and healing. Those are not concepts in our justice system. I think we have a lot to learn as Americans.
I could talk to you about that one topic for a long time. I think it's just thoroughly fascinating. But there are a couple other things we want to touch on today. One of which is you've written about parental rights, this concept of free-range parenting. Can you get into a bit of what that's about, how you stumbled into that topic?
I actually got into it as a result, in large part, of our living abroad. I swear, I wouldn't believe this story if I heard it told to me. Our landlady, we saw our landlady put money in the hands of a 3-year-old granddaughter and sent her to the bakery to buy bread. And so a 3-year-old went out to buy bread alone. And she didn't have to cross any streets. It was just down the block. And the baker knew the 3-year-old, took the money and gave the bread and gave the change. And the 3-year-old came back and was very proud of herself for having done something helpful. And we were like aghast. You would send a 3-year-old out on a task like that. But it was normal there. And we encountered similar things. Later, we moved to Romania. I did judicial reform in Romania. Then I went to work for the United Nations, and we were in the Netherlands. And in the Netherlands, kids ride their bikes everywhere, and they take public transit everywhere. 6-year-old hopping on the city bus, taking it all the way across town to get to or from school. These are things that most Americans wouldn't let a 6-year-old do, yet this was very normal. Kids were very self-sufficient, and we got used to living in societies like that. Later, we moved to Sudan. When I was with the UN, I was the head of rule of law for South Sudan. Our kids were in the city of Khartoum. They took the equivalent of public transit. It really wasn't any public transit. There were these sort of freelance bus drivers that would get a bus and drive a route, and if you got on, you gave some money, and our kids figured out how to use those, and strangers on the bus were usually very kind to them. We became confident that they were okay, even in a country like Sudan that was hostile to the United States and hostile to the United Nations. But even there, our kids could go out in town and feel safe. So when we came back to the United States, I was shocked because we had high schoolers, and it was like, the high schoolers need to be driven everywhere. The high schoolers can't get themselves from point A to point B. If there's soccer practice, the parents don't just say, hop on your bike and go to soccer practice. No, the parents strap them into an SUV and, and drive them there. And then, then parents then stay and watch the whole thing to make sure their kids are okay. And then somebody provides treats, and they're all in sealed plastic packages because of safety, right? You think of bringing home baked cookies for the soccer team because safety, we're all obsessed with safety. After living for 6 years abroad, it seemed like we were infantilizing our teenagers in really kind of shocking ways. And they don't learn independence, and they don't learn to solve their own problems because their parents are constantly hovering over them. About that time, Lenore Skenazy published her book, Free Range Kids. And I heard her speak and went up to her afterwards and said, have you thought about legal liability issues here? And she said, I've never thought about that. I said, well, if we live in a world where people are obsessed with child safety, Lenore Skenazy, her book suggested that we are infantilizing our children, and we're not doing them any favors by protecting them from having to deal with problems or solve problems on their own. We should should turn them loose and let them go out and play and explore, and they'll develop a better sense of adventure and self-sufficiency and responsibility if we trust them. I said in my first article in 2012 on this topic that the child neglect laws are so vaguely worded now, and popular opinion about what constitutes good parenting has evolved to such a degree now that I'm quite concerned that a parent who decides to let their child go play in the park unsupervised, somebody's going to call the cops. And so I published that article, and it got tremendous play, got linked to a whole lot of parenting blogs and things. And then shortly thereafter, we started seeing the arrests, where parents were getting arrested for this sort of thing. And that's what really launched my career, I think, as an academic. I'd written all these great articles about post-conflict justice that very few people read. But then I wrote this article about parenting, and everybody cared about that. That was a big impact. And I ended up writing quite a number of follow-up articles about parents' constitutional rights, about not just the criminal justice system of child neglect, but also the child protective services and the standards for when they get involved, and maybe why we are, as a society, too obsessed with child safety and enforcing laws in such a way to deprive parents of their own flexibility and discretion in how they raise their kids. I mean, parents, nobody knows better what your kid needs than you, they're the parent. And yet somehow all your neighbors and the police and the child protective service agencies, I think they know better. This came out of cultural differences. In Scandinavia, you take your child to the cafe in a stroller. If the child's asleep, you leave the stroller on the sidewalk outside while you go into the cafe. And you go to Copenhagen, cafes have all these strollers out there. They insist on having their kids take their naps outdoors, even in sub-freezing temperatures, because they're convinced that's healthy. And Scandinavians, they have a great track record in terms of child mortality rates and in terms of health and in terms of happiness and well-being. So it's hard to argue that they're getting it wrong. In fact, because all the kids at daycare take their naps outdoors, they don't share germs the way ours do. Everybody who sends their kids to daycare know they come home with all kinds of bugs that they picked up there. Maybe the Danes and the Swedes are onto something, but we need to be open to that. I advocate in my scholarship that we need to make sure that our child neglect laws are written in such a way that preserve parental discretion and that recognize that there are myriad ways to parent correctly or to parent properly. We can't have a system where somebody looks at something another parent is doing and says, I would never do that. And because I would never do that with my kid, you need to be punished, right? And we're back to punishing bad guys. So you see a child that you think is inadequately supervised, and their first impulse in America is not to help the child. The first impulse in America is to call the cops, which is crazy because then the police show up and they arrest the mom, and the mom goes to jail and the kid goes to foster care. And the person who called it in is feeling very righteous about it. And what have they done? They've destroyed a family and heaped an enormous amount of problems on that child because we have our heads a little screwed up in terms of how we think about these things. So I feel a certain amount of passion about this, as you can tell.
Your work on this topic has been cited in court cases, has it not?
Yeah. In Kansas and in Iowa and in Maryland have cited and quoted me at length in overturning convictions and saying, hold it, wait a minute. Just because something bad happened here or because something bad could have happened here doesn't automatically make the parent a neglectful parent. Well, you can't define child neglect in terms of exposing children to risk because everything you do exposes a child to risk. If you leave your child home alone for 45 minutes while you dash out to the store, there's certain risks associated with that. But what are the risks of taking the child with you? Well, then you're putting the child into a moving vehicle. That's where children die. They don't die at home because they've been left alone. They die in car accidents. That used to be the number one cause of childhood death was cars. Now it's gun violence. Yet, overwhelmingly, Americans would say, I would never leave my child alone. I will take them with me. And it's like, it's not about eliminating risk. It's about managing risk. And parenting is all risk management. And with paralyzed parents, we've made it really hard to parent because you can't afford to expose your child to any risk or to what another person might perceive to be an unacceptable risk, because then they'll call the cops on you, right? And so you can't trust your instincts anymore. You have to worry about what other people are going to think. And that's not a healthy thing for parents.
One last thing I want to get into. Your work, it seems like it deals a lot with these underlying cultural things. And one paper that you wrote that I just thought was really interesting was about how music can lead to societal and legal changes.
Yeah, I love this. This is a really fun project for me. I'm a fan of old jazz, and I love the Lionel Hampton Jazz Festival here every year. And I began looking into the blues and the origins of the blues, and ended up developing a paper suggesting that the civil rights era, the 1950s, 1960s, where we started seeing real serious changes in America, came about the time that blues music became popular among white audiences. And so I posited that the blues was born as a musical form, came out of the suffering of the Black American communities. Blues music flourished in Black communities. And then at some point, the blues made this transition. Louis Armstrong was enormously popular with white audiences. But you take a song like Black and Blue, and he's lamenting, why am I so black and blue? The reason he's sad is because he's Black, and because he's Black, he can't get any respect in this society. I noted the timing and suggested that perhaps blues music played a major role in changing American attitudes when white audiences started listening to the music and understanding in ways that perhaps they had never before done the plight of the African American and how hard it is and what horrible injustices that they suffer. This relates to everything else I do, right? Because this is all about understanding a cultural difference, right? How does the Black community view justice in America? And how does the white community view justice in America? And if we can understand each other, then maybe we can move forward. And art is a big part of this. I wrote originally about blues, and I presented this paper at the International Conference on the Blues in Cleveland, Mississippi, in Delta Blues Country. And I give a lecture inspired by it every year now at the Lionel Hampton Jazz Festival. I'll do that again next month. But I started getting questions saying, well, what about the 21st century? And at first I thought, well, I don't know, there's hip hop music out there that certainly complains about police brutality. But my initial off-the-cuff response was, well, I don't see hip hop having that same sort of impact, because, members of Congress are not listening to songs entitled F the Police. It's not reaching the white audiences that the blues did. I mean, when Nina Simone first performed her just incredibly revolutionary piece, Mississippi Goddamn, within 3 months she was singing it at Carnegie Hall. And I can tell you that the Carnegie Hall audience was not all Black. These were affluent New Yorkers, white New Yorkers, and they were hearing that lament, right? Then I got it while I was trying to get my presentation published. I hired a research assistant who'd grown up right here in the Palouse, had grown up over in Pullman, and I was bouncing ideas off my research assistant, Zach Mumford, and I mentioned the hip hop stuff, and he says, I grew up on that stuff. And I said, white kid from the Palouse? He says, absolutely. I devoured that stuff all the time I was growing up, and I realized that white kids are in fact listening to hip hop. And by 2003, the majority of the audience for hip hop was white. So while they may not be members of Congress yet, Zach and his entire generation will be members of Congress in 10 or 20 years, right? And their attitudes about justice in America for Black Americans are very much shaped by Kendrick Lamar and by Childish Gambino, Chuck D of Public Enemy. They write songs that talk about this in really compelling and meaningful ways. And so I think it's happening. And you see it in all kinds of art too, right? Poetry slam, in literature, books like The Hate You Give and On the Come Up are really eye-opening, I think. Talking about the art, talking about the rap, talking about the issues. It's exciting for me to think that change may be possible, not through changing the laws or rewriting constitutions, because that's a big part of my career. I went to Sudan to help write new constitutions and create a new legal system for South Sudan. But that isn't what changes the world. You can come in and write a whole bunch of new laws. You can change the structure of the judiciary. But if the same people with the same attitudes and the same level of corruption are going to run the new institutions as they ran the old institutions, you really haven't changed much. You need to change attitudes. You need to change the way people think and feel about justice. And maybe art does that better than law does.
Yeah, I think you're probably right about that. What is it that you want people to most take away from your work?
This is a theme in my comparative law class, which I really love to teach every year. We study Islamic law, and we study African customary law, and we study Native American law and Jewish Talmudic law, Hindu and Confucian influenced systems, to recognize that there's a real diversity of perspectives and values. and that we can never presume that we've got a monopoly on what's best or what's true or what justice is or what justice should be or what good parenting is, right? What I think is good parenting may not be ideal parenting for your kids in your situation. And the hubris that we in our society demonstrate regularly by condemning people. And of course, online social media culture really feeds the trolls. It's really easy to get on there and condemn somebody. That person should be locked up, lock him up. These sorts of things, they're all manifestations of judgment. And we are so quick and so eager to pass judgment on others, applying our own sort of ethical principles because we can't imagine that anybody could think differently about these things. And it's a huge divide in America. We can't find common ground because we somehow cannot open up our minds and our eyes enough to understand that there are different ways to think about these things. And maybe we can learn things from each other. That's, I think, what I hope people will take from my work is a conviction that we need to be more humble. The whole field of rule of law reform has been plagued by this. Western societies go into troubled countries and say, oh, you just need to do it the way we do it back in Germany, or you need to do it just the way we do it back in the United States. And it works great for us. I'm sure it'll work great for you. Well, it doesn't work for them. They have different values and different priorities, different things they're trying to accomplish in their society. And we can learn a whole lot from systems and people who are different from ourselves.
I think there's a really good life lesson there. Well, thank you so much for being on the podcast. I really love talking to you. This has been great.
It's been my pleasure.
Okay, Lee, what did you think about this interview?
Oh my gosh. As much as I want to talk about the parenting and the music and stuff, I think the thing that kind of just sat me in my seat on this one was his international law experience and just how humbling it was to listen to that. I mean, I definitely grew up thinking, the US, man, we've got it figured out. We got this democracy thing down. And the more I learn as I grow up and the more I learn about the complexities of our society, the more you can see the flaws and places for improvement. And it's humbling to have other societies who are setting up their democracies questioning it. And we should take those questions seriously.
I agree with that. I think it's super fascinating, and I just love this idea of keeping an open mind, and that, as he said at the end, that sort of is an underlying theme of his work. But regarding the parenting topic, it is, people have such strong opinions about that, but the fact of the matter is there's more than one way to raise a kid, and it varies from kid to kid and parent to parent, and you might have vastly different parenting styles and your kid's still going to turn out all right. And I just think that's fascinating, and it's something to, keep in mind.
Yeah, just the idea of always go in asking questions. How can we better this? How can we improve this? What can we learn from someone else who's doing this different? It's, again, super humbling.
Yeah, I think it's a great underlying question for this podcast, too.
So true.
Okay, everyone, thank you for listening to the Vandal Theory. You can visit our website at uidaho.edu/Vandal Theory to learn more about our podcast and research. Email us at vandaltheory@uidaho.edu. We are on all of the podcasting platforms, so please rate, review, and subscribe. I'm Janae Lenz.
And I'm Lee Cooper.
Thanks for joining us.